Morning rose over a village built from interlocking bricks and bright intention. A patchwork of studded streets and cheerful roofs, where every window reflected the day as if daylight itself had been clicked into place. The villagers gathered, not to cheer, but to understand. Because a real hero makes silence into a promise. On the town hall wall, half hidden behind festival bunting, an ancient mosaic told a story in glass-like tiles. It pictured a towering burger held above a crater. The law had a recipe, and the recipe had a wish. The chef stood before the mosaic until he could smell the meaning. Ingredients would not be begged from the market or borrowed from the pantry. They would be earned from the mountain itself, taken with care from danger, and arranged with respect, so the danger would remember its manners. He nodded once to the village, and the village found the strength to nod back. The mission assembled itself in his mind. 6 elements. 6 labors, 1 mercy. The bread would come from the lava caverns, where heat wrote poetry on stone. The patty would come from a field of living rock, a place where stubbornness learned to walk. The cheese would come from a waterfall of melted light, a curtain that sang in warmth. Tomatoes would grow on ember trees, their fruit as bright as belief. Lettuce would sleep in ash grottos, silvered by smoke and cooled by patience. Sauce would wait at the summit, guarded by fountains that rose and fell like the mountain's pulse. He tightened his scarf and set his feet to the slope. The path began in switchbacks cut from dark plates.
He decanted the sauce into a vessel built like a lantern and set it beside the other ingredients. For a long moment he stood in the summit wind and let the mountain look at him. He did not hurry. The village had sent him, but the mountain would permit him. When the next breath of the vents came softer, he stepped to the altar and laid out his plan as a mason would map a cathedral. He placed the first loaf at the center and pressed down until its underside found every stud meant to meet it. He circled the bread with his spoon, smoothing invisible air, then fanned the lettuce in a lattice, leaf edge into leaf edge, so green formed a net that could catch a red world. Tomatoes arrived in interlocking curves, their grooves nesting until roundness agreed to behave. He turned each piece a quarter step, listening for the broader balance, as someone might listen for harmony hidden below melody. The patties came next, dark and patient, their surfaces glossed by vent heat. He set one, then the other, and pressed with the back of the spoon until the sear sang a faint note. Cheese crossed over cheese at slight diagonals, the first sheet anchoring the second bracing the first, criss-cross stitching that asked movement to choose dignity. He ringed the layer with onion arcs placed like halos laid carefully aside, then scattered crisp shards that would melt into texture without surrendering their identity. The sauce would decide everything. He lifted the lantern vessel and poured in lines, not as a river, but as a constellation, dots and tiny trails earning the right to hold the whole together. The vents brightened, flaring up as if leaning closer to see. He grounded his stance, let his breath lengthen, and threaded one final ribbon across the crown of the layer. binding edges that had never needed to part, but liked knowing they never would. For a second, the altar shook, as if the mountain remembered its temper. The tower leaned the way a question leans. The chef moved one cheese sheet a hair's breadth to the left and rotated a tomato half by half a notch. The tower returned from its question with an answer. He reached.
The tower returned from its question with an answer. He reached for the second loaf, the top, a curve of bread polished until it reflected the sky's edge. He lowered it in slow ceremony until it found home and told the rest of the burger that the journey had not been a rumor. The burger of fire stood. The vents sighed. The fountain of sauce settled into a steady dome and then into nothing. Lava that had leapt now flowed in calm lines along channels the altar revealed, splitting into 4 paths that circled the tower like guardians and ran into slots around the base. The altar blossomed into a grate, heat rising in a disciplined column that kissed the burger with a glow that traveled from crust to heart and back, sealing flavors to intention. The volcano, politer now, exhaled a steady warmth that turned from threat to kitchen. Below, the village watched the mountains soften. The shivers subsided, replaced by a hum that sounded like agreement. The windmill turned with unhurried ease. Cats fashioned from 2 slopes and a whisker tile resumed their lazy ownership of doorsteps. People smiled without needing to check the ground first. The chef tested the burger's temperature, not for heat alone, but for readiness, the way readiness feels when everything inside has said yes. He built a litter from wide plates and sturdy beams hidden beneath the altar lip, slid the burger of fire onto its cradle, and lifted with care taught by heavy days. The path downward was still steep, still rocky, still complicated, but the mountain had traded menace for mentorship. Where a step had been too slick, it offered a ridge. Where a corner had been mean, it became instructive. At the mouth of the lava cave, the air cooled from hot glass to warm brick. At the field of golems, the guardians reassembled into steady platforms, choosing peace without admitting sentiment. He entered the square as the sun angled toward praise. Tables had emerged from storage like memories reclaiming space. The villagers lined the path with plates, cups, napkins folded into triangles by hands that needed to do something helpful. The chef set the burger on the central plinth, a disc of stone that had hosted speeches and sunflowers and now would host a calm mountain. He studied the structure once more, then lifted a long cutting guide shaped like a narrow bridge and pressed it into the crown. The first slice fell open without falling apart, cross-section shining like a map of effort. Bread that had learned crust from flame, lettuce that had learned duty from pattern, tomatoes that had learned citizenship from grooves, patties that had learned flavor from pressure, cheese that had learned teamwork from angles, onion rings that had learned humility, crisp shards that had learned how to make a point without being sharp, sauce that had learned diplomacy. He portioned piece after piece, each wedge clean and confident. Children accepted slices with 2 hands. Elders received theirs on plates that had served generations of celebrations. Friends shared bites and traded descriptions as if words were seasoning. In the first wave of tasting, something passed between faces that could not quite be named. It was relief, and it was luck, and it was the relief of discovering luck earned by work. The volcano glowed on the horizon like a hearth in a neighbor's window.
The wind turned gentle enough to braid smells into a ribbon that circled the square, remembering everyone equally. Musicians lifted instruments assembled from spare parts and imagination, and notes stitched the edges of the scene together so nothing would fray. The chef took a slice only when the last child had one, and the last grandparent had nodded approval, and the last shy person had been waved forward by someone who understood shyness. He ate standing, eyes on the mountain, tasting not just heat and herb and salt and sweet, but the pattern that had carried him from the mosaic to the altar and back. The spoon rested across his palm like a satisfied companion. The sun slid lower and found the volcano's glassy seams, making them blush from within. The square changed colors with the sky, gold into rose into the kind of blue that invited lamps to try their best. People settled into easy conversations. Laughter traveled at a respectful pace. Stories budded about the moment the top loaf touched down, about the golems who had never smiled and somehow still approved, about the cheese fall whose song would be hummed for days by those who could not carry a tune and those who could. When the plates had more crumbs than plans, the chef began to clean the plinth. It was not duty only. It was a way of saying the moment would not be lost, only stored. He lifted stray leaves into a compost crate, stacked plates into towers that did not wobble, wiped sauces into swirls that unintentionally looked like a signature. Villagers drifted over and drifted away, leaving behind thanks that did not need words. The mountain sighed again, a deep, regular breath sliding through its vents like a bedtime story. Stars assembled themselves above the village with the meticulous calm of builders who never rush. The windmill slowed to a thoughtful spin. Windows lit one by one and then two by two until the square reflected constellations back to the sky. The chef stood at the plinth with his spoon and looked outward as if willing his eyes to hold twice as much. The people and their peace, the volcano and its new manners. He thought of the mosaic and understood that it had never been a warning so much as a promise disguised as instruction. The burger of fire did not tame a mountain, it reminded a mountain that its heat could be hospitality. He thought of the loaves that learned sheen from tunnels, of patties that learned tenderness from pressure, of cheese that learned architecture from a fall, of tomatoes that learned to hover until chosen, of lettuce that learned to weave coolness into smoke, of sauce that learned to gather edges into us. He thought of how balance happens when every layer accepts the work of the next. The square, never quite still, quieted toward comfortable endings. Someone placed a lantern at the base of the mast where speeches were given. Someone else left a small tile painted with a crown beside the plinth. The chef lifted the spoon for a final inspection of the night and then let it rest across his forearms, a bar that measured his contentment. He turned toward the mountain and bowed, not low, not theatrically, but exactly as deep as gratitude required. When he looked back at the village, he saw what the day had built. Not only a meal or a story or a new habit for a volcano, but a pattern people could keep. If morning arrived tomorrow with a new puzzle, there would be hands to hold it, tools to meet it, time to learn it, and a recipe somewhere that whispered the shape of the answer. He stepped down from the plinth and crossed the square with the gait of someone who had walked uphill and downhill and found the right pace for both. Night settled fully, confident, and kind. The volcano glowed like a sleeping ember, a red that warmed rather than warned. The village lay back on the studded earth and let the sky carry its nodding. The Lego chef paused at the gate, touched the brim of his hat to the stars, and let the wooden spoon tap his palm once.
a soft punctuation at the end of a long, gracious sentence. The day's heat had become flavor. The mountain's voice had become music. Balance had become supper. And supper had become a way to remember that everything dangerous can choose to be generous if someone builds the right place for it to rest.